I have to fix my lighting in a second, but we'll just wait for that. We'll just give it a couple minutes before we actually start. All right. Just close the door behind me. At least try to anyway. Hello and welcome. Need to fix the lighting first. Yikes. Why is this lighting so bad right now? We don't have enough of this one or something. I don't know. Anyway, hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the Book of Kings. And today we're going to finish up 2 Kings, which we'll read from chapter 21 to 25. I think. Yeah, we're going to read from chapter 21 to 25. So we read a little bit more today, which means this video is going to be a little bit longer because we have to cover an extra chapter, but in the grand scheme, and then of course we have some closing thoughts as we finish the Book of Kings, right? So that's really all there is to really kind of talk about before. I don't think I really need to do a recap of other weeks, because I will obviously do like an overall talk about the book in general at the very end. So if you want to follow along, I'll be using the New International Version, or NIV. You can, use a Bible app or BibleGateway.com if you're on your desktop or whatever, right? No reason not to use it. They're free. And so with that, I'm just going to start with a quick word of prayer, and we're just going to dive right into it. Let's just bow our heads for a moment. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this opportunity we have to read your word. And I pray that as we read through the Book of Kings, and as we finish it up today, that you would remind us why it's so important that we trust in you. And I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so just going to flip to it myself first. But really, there's not a lot of summary I have to talk about once again. We'll talk more about the overarching themes of the book at the very end. So we'll just kind of cover that then. But for right now, we're just going to read through the last few chapters, which covers basically the last set of kings in Judah. Because, as we read last week, is the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, is basically no longer a thing because they had been taken over by the Assyrians. But the land of Judah will hold out a little bit longer. How much longer? Well, we're about to find out as we read through the next 5 chapters. So here we go, starting with chapter 21 of 2 Kings. Chapter 21. So Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years. I don't know if you can hear that. Sorry, there's just like this honking noise. I think there's something up with the piping, but just kind of have to deal with it. I need to maybe find an insular on my mic or figure some kind of thing to make sure I don't get as much background noise. But anyway, let's move on. I'm going to restart. Chapter 21. So Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years. His mother's name was Hephzibah. That's a great name. Hephzibah. Now Manasseh did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab king of Israel had done. He bowed down to all the starry host and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." In the 2 courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry host. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. So he took Manasseh took the carved Asherah pole he had made and put it in the temple, of which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will not make the feet of the Israelites wander from the land I gave their ancestors. If only they will be careful to do everything I commanded them, and will keep the whole law that my servant Moses gave them." But the people didn't listen, and Manasseh led them astray, so that they did more evil than the nations that the Lord destroyed before them. Now the Lord said through his servants the prophets, "Manasseh king of Judah has committed these detestable sins. He has done more evil than the Amorites who preceded him, and has led Judah into sin with idols. Therefore this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: I am going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. I will stretch out over Jerusalem the measuring line against Samaria, and the plumb line used against the house of Ahab. I will wipe out Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance, and I will give them into the hands of enemies. They will be looted and plundered by them. They have done evil in my eyes and have aroused my anger from the day their ancestors came out of Egypt until this day." Moreover, Manasseh, who also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end, besides the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. As for the other events of Manasseh's reign, and all that he did, including the sin he committed, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Manasseh rested with his ancestors, and was buried in his palace garden, the garden of Uzzah. And Amon, his son, succeeded him as king. Now Amon was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 2 years. His mother's name was, how the hell do you say that? Meshelemeth. I think that's how you say that. Daughter of Harez. She was from Yotba. Now Amon did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Manasseh had done. He followed completely the ways of his father, worshipping the idols his father had worshipped, and bowing down to them. He forsook the Lord, the God of his ancestors, and did not walk in obedience to them. Now Amon's officials conspired against him and assassinated the king in the palace. Then the people of the land killed all who had plotted against King Amon, and they made Josiah his son king in his place. As for the other events of Amon's reign, and what he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Now he was buried in his tomb in the garden of Uzzah. Sorry, I totally pronounced it differently this time. Uzzah, and Josiah his son succeeded him as king. Alright, so chapter 21 paints a pretty bad picture, right? So chapter 21 just gives us this short account of 2 kings after Hezekiah. And it turns out both of them were pretty awful, right? So basically, well, going back, Hezekiah, if you recall last week, Hezekiah was an interesting character because, in a way, it was his kind of Puritan Jewish attitude, I guess if you want to call it that. I mean, his Puritan style Judaism, it actually was the foundation for a lot of Jewish practice later on after the exile, because a lot of people saw like his Puritan style as like, oh, this is how we can honor God and be good with God, and not run into the kind of trouble that they're about to run into as we read through the book of Kings. And so Hezekiah, he was kind of out there, right, in his methods as well, because like he went all in. He was very strict on like, no, we only worship God in this one particular way, sacrifices only in Jerusalem and all that stuff, right? And so he tore down these high places, and as well as like these other altars that were around. But the sad reality is that like, he dies, and then his son Manasseh takes the crown, right? And Manasseh basically undoes everything his dad did, right? Which has got to be like the thing that makes him like roll in his grave. I mean, makes Hezekiah roll in his grave, right? That like his son basically undid everything that his father did. And Manasseh's described to like do a bunch of pretty bad things, right? So he like sacrificed his own son, the whole child sacrifice thing, which the Bible's made pretty clear that's a big no-no. And so Manasseh did that. He rebuilt all the high places and the altars to other gods. And then an extra slap on the face that apparently Manasseh was said to be like one of the worst kings. And there's a little bit of this in Chronicles as well, where none of the other kings, even though they were pretty bad, did not have the balls to like defile the temple of God by putting like the statues of other gods in the Lord's temple in Jerusalem, right? And so, he goes the whole nine. Manasseh goes the whole 9.5 yards, right? And he he puts like these like statues in the temple, and that is like kind of like the last straw, right? And God's like, okay, like you've got to be kidding me, like you can't be this bad. But I guess to everyone's surprise, Manasseh is that bad, and it really shows too that like he must have been so bad, because God now kind of decides to really be like mean about it and be kind of, I don't want to say petty, because God isn't being petty in the way that we humans would be. I mean, I guess you could make the argument that he is, right? But I mean, to be fair, once again, most of us would behave in the same way God does in this case, right? Like imagine if you were living with somebody. You were living with somebody, right? And you had like your nice gaming system, with your nice TV, and you had your like your decorums in the house, right? The things that are yours, and they're like your favorite chair, right? That you like to sit in front, your favorite chair or your favorite couch that you sit on to play your video games on or whatever, right? Now you have all that. There's your space. You're part of the living room that makes it like part of you, right? And then you know someone that's like a roommate or something decides to like throw that all out and then completely replace it with like, I don't know, like their booty calls stuff. I know that sounds like this is I'm going extreme here, but this is kind of, I'm trying to paint this picture of what would be like the equivalent of what Manasseh's done in like our human terms, right? So imagine if like you had a roommate, right? And they throw out your nice ass TV, they throw out your PS4, or even for those of you who got the PS5, throws that out, right? And gets rid of your couch that you love to sit on when you're playing on your PS5, right? And your roommate throws that all out and then puts like some pretty like low quality stuff, and it's kind of trashy because it kind of belongs to a not so reputable girl, but she's his squeeze, right? And it's her stuff, and it's her junk that takes place on what used to be like your space, right? And you would think like, well, what the actual shit, right? Like, you don't do that to people, right? You don't do that to a roommate. And so that's kind of what Manasseh was doing, was like insulting God by like throwing out the promises of God and the altar that was the way it was, which, as the Bible points out, was meant to be a reminder to the people that like God would not forsake you, right? And there's this other thing where there's a part of the altar in Jerusalem that was to remind the people that like this is where God will make his name and dwell among his people, right? And Manasseh's like, screw this, I don't need this in this temple, right? He tosses it out and then replaces it with one of his other gods, right? And so in essence, right? And there's that part where when you read it like that, right? When Manasseh taints the temple like that and throws out like, imagine if you had like a how some churches they have that nice little banner and it's like they'll put Bible verses on them, and one of the Bible verses would be like, I would never leave you or forsake you, and someone took that and threw it out of the church. And then when you do that, that's kind of like a declaration of like, well, I don't need you. And so God's like, fine, I guess I'm not welcome here. See ya. I can go somewhere else, right? And that's basically what God does. He's like, all right, fine. You don't want me here? I'll go somewhere else, right? You're on your own. And so I think when you read it that way, as we should read it, then it doesn't. The reason why I have to kind of paint it this way, because I know a lot of people would read this passage and they would be like, well, that makes God look kind of petty, right? Because he then abandons Israel, even though he promised that he wouldn't, right? But when you read it in much more human terms like that, right? And once again, this is going back to the whole like God being a person, and that's a fundamental part of him being a personal God in the Christian belief. You know, you can push God past the thresholds that would normally piss off other people, right? And so that's basically what Manasseh is doing here. And that is a pretty big slap in the face, right? To defile the temple the way he does. And to make the declaration of like, okay, I don't like, he's basically saying in effect, like, I don't need you, God, right? You don't belong here, God, right? And then so God's like, fine, I'll have it, fine, have it your way, right? You don't want me here, then I'm not here. Of course, the problem ends up being, and remember, we read back in chapters 19 and 20, more in chapter 20, where, well, let me check, let me just make sure. I think it's chapter 19, actually, where this happens. In chapter 19, when Hezekiah trusted God to protect him, right? And so God does, and he takes out, the Assyrian army, Grim Reaper style. And basically, it was a reminder to the reader that, like, no matter how big the odds are against you, when you put your faith in God, then, he would be there and protect you and take care of you, right? Even when the odds are absurdly against you. But that is, but God would only really fulfill that when we place our trust in him. Which I know me wording it that way may make some people question, but doesn't, isn't God's like love for us unconditional and stuff like that? I mean, I think one, that's not an accurate teaching. God's love isn't quote unquote unconditional. What many people misinterpret is that God can love anyone. But when we say unconditional love, that's not what that means, right? Because, for instance, like if you were to, help somebody, you always have conditions, right? At least a little bit of recognition is usually one of your conditions. And then, of course, when you would help someone, you hope they wouldn't squander what you've given them. And then, of course, other conditions. And here's the thing, too, when we talk about like conditions within love, right? A lot of these conditions are like, they're never explicitly said because most of us as human beings and as we live in society, we assume these to be the case anytime we interact with people. We assume this to be the case because it's one of those things that if these things cannot be assumed, among consenting adults or any human beings really, if these assumptions can't be assumed, then you really don't have a society. So some of these assumptions would be like, okay, if you and I were to do a business transaction, we would trust that we would both hold up our ends of the agreement, right? There's not going to be any kind of shifty changing of hands. There won't be any backstabbing for sure, right? Because I mean that's why betrayal is viewed as like one of the highest sins, right? Because you think of something as important as like this underlying consent of trust, right? That would be a massive thing to violate. And so going back to God, the misinterpretation of like God's unconditional love. Many people say that because they would say, well, God can love anyone. He can forgive any sin, and that's true. But, the famous verse that a lot of people would cite, John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And then you read the rest of it, right? So that whoever believes in him, and there's the condition, right? Whoever believes in him shall not die, but have life everlasting, right? And so there is actually a condition there, right? Because yes, God gave, you know, his son in the person of Christ to cleanse the world of sin. But the condition to receive that is you must believe, right? Otherwise, you run into like universalism was a big problem, right? For example, I remember there was a whole hot topic controversy with a dude named, I think his name was Rob Bell, if memory serves. It was a long time ago. I think Rob Bell has fallen out of relevancy because most people most Christians have kind of decided that no, his way of teaching is not real Christianity, and anyone who's accepted his teachings are basically now viewed as all heretics, right? So, but in Rob Bell's teaching, he talks about how, like, well, you know, since God died for the world, then everybody is, you know, cleansed of sin. Therefore, you know, it doesn't matter whether in this life you actually believe in God or not, which actually contradicts the Bible then, right? Because in John 3:16, as I quoted, there is actually a condition to receive that forgiveness and to receive that cleansing, right? There actually is a condition, you know, whoever believes in him. And so going back to the Book of Kings now, you know, there were conditions. We remember back when Solomon first built the temple. There were conditions, and God told Solomon the conditions, right? As long as you follow my statutes, your dynasty will be forever. That was basically it, right? Which, to be fair though, I mean that is a very high cost, right? And so a little bit of failing here and there, you know, and I've made jokes about like David not being the best king, and I talk about in the book of Samuel how once again the main theme is that well only God can be king. So the book was very transparent about showing David's failures, right? Because it was to remind us that no human being can really be king ultimately in our lives because all humans fail. And that was the telltale of David's story, right? But at the same time, the Bible recognizes that David, for the most part, let's put it this way: God is willing to overlook some failures because God is understanding and empathetic that we as humans are mortal and we're weak, right? And we are prone to failure, right? And God is forgiving in that, right? Once again, you know, looking at David as the prime example, right? David had quite a number of failings, actually, right? But God was willing to forgive him each time. And while, yes, David had his failings, there were a lot of times where David would obey God and would do as God told him. But of course, you know, once again, the other telltale is that like it is when David kind of slips in that is why he fails, right? And the other thing too is that like, you know, we as modern people understand that like it would be impossible to do it perfectly. And that's once again, you know, the Christian view of why, you know, Jesus also had to be man and he is God, right? And so because he's God, he can fulfill it perfectly because he's the one who made the rules. And then he's also a man so that he could live out his own rules perfectly. That's kind of I know it's a weird way of looking at things, but I mean that's why people think Christianity is weird in general, right? Because of that weird paradox in the person of Jesus. But the overlying theme is still there, right? That as we, at least for the most part, live up to God's standards, once again, you know, people would say, well, it's impossible to do that, but at the same time, God wants you to put in some effort, right? You gotta at least try, right? Because even if you, like, God is forgiving when we fail in those things. And that's something that a lot of people tend to forget too, you know, like, I think that's one of the big cruxes for a lot of people of why they don't want to be Christians. They think like, well, if I become a believer, then I have to follow these impossible rules, and I can't do that. So I don't know if I can be a believer. But that's a very skewed way of thinking in general, right? Because I mean that's true about relationships in real life, right? No one can hold any relationship that they have with anyone really perfectly, right? That's just once again it's us being human, and we just have to accept that that's just the way it is, right? But you know when when we try to do you know what God commands us and we're you know genuine about it, you know God is like yeah good enough job, right? And there are moments like that in the Bible, right? Like Abraham is a good example of that, right? God was like good enough, right? Even though Abraham had his number of failings, God's like good enough, right? You're doing what I've asked you to do, even when you stumble along the way, right? And that's something we can, as moderns, as we read through the Bible stories, we can learn those lessons, right? That like, okay, we're never going to be perfect, but as we attempt to live out, as best as we can, and not like half-ass, you know, but actually like attempt to live out what God commands us to do, then God is very forgiving about that, and God accepts us, right? Of course, don't get me wrong here. I'm not just saying that like, okay, you don't have to be a believer. Just try hard, and then God would think that's good enough, right? Because once again, Jesus sets up a new standard by saying that like, well, you would still have to, believe in me, because that is the only real way to heaven, is what Jesus basically says, right? You have to believe in me, and that's John 16, right? And the whole discourse that he had with his disciples. But that'll be its own crazy talk down the road, right? Because that's a pretty loaded conversation I don't want to have right now. Because that would be like we could spend a whole stream talking about that, and then some, right? But basically, what I'm getting at here is, I know I've detracted quite away from like, we're reading Second Kings here, but the big difference between like Manasseh and why God is very unforgiving. This is where we're coming back to, right? Because I was talking about like God being forgiving about a lot of things. But where God is really unforgiving is when Manasseh deliberately pushes God away, right? Because the contrast I'm trying to make here is that God is super forgiving as long as like, okay, you're not pushing God away. You may try to approach God, but you suck every step along the way. God is extremely forgiving in that regard, right? That's what I was getting at. But Manasseh here is deliberately pushing God away. And this is one of the big dangers in our culture today, right? There's this, push by the media, or, certain political groups and certain ideologies. I'll leave it at that. That vilify God and want to not just push God away in their own lives, but they want to make other people do it and make other people push God away and make, us even further away from God as a society in general, right? And to push us further and further away from God. Well, that's a very dangerous road to go down, right? Because eventually, you know, God's going to be like, fine, if you don't want me around, I won't be around. And that would be a very scary thought for us today, especially when we read what happened to the kingdom of Israel, right? Where they pushed God away and he's like, fine, you're on your own. And this is the interesting thing too, right? Because, you know what's going to happen to Judah now. You know what's going to happen because we've already seen it with the northern kingdom of Israel, right? They pushed God away. They were like, no, we don't want anything to do with you. And God was like, fine, you don't want anything to do with me, then I'm gone. I'm gonna go do something else, right? Because I got other things to do too, right? And so God leaves, metaphorically speaking, and probably even literally too. He leaves Israel, and then what happens? Israel gets like trampled by the Assyrians, and then of course like they're made fun of by the other nations, and like, haha, laughing stock, you know the the how the mighty have fallen, etc., right? And they're kind of made fun of. Now Judah looks like they're going to be on the fast track of that too because of Manasseh's behavior. So I think like the first part of chapter 21, there's already so much to talk about, right? Because of that and the implications. I mean, once again, it's the Bible's way of just hammering home the idea of like how dangerous it is to push God out of your life, right? Because that's a very dangerous way of living, right? Now I'm not talking about like, once again, I'm trying to make it a very clear distinction from like when you try to live for God and you fail, because that's completely different, right? Because we're as human beings, we are prone to fail to live up to God's standards. That's different. That's completely different. I'm not talking about that at all. And so I if you're, thinking about your faith life and you're thinking like, man, I don't know if I can live up to God's standards. It's so hard, da 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 da, right? that's not the point. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is the outright rejection of God, which we do see a lot in our society as well, with certain, ideologies and agendas that really want to push out, God out of the equation, right? They don't want God to be part of our society and whatnot. And that is a dangerous route, because that could lead to the kind of stuff that we read about with Israel. And, you can see where this is going with Judah. Do I even need a spoiler warning? Like, what's going to happen, right? You know what's going to happen. We already seen it happen. You know what's going to happen. And so that's basically, the main theme in chapter 21 to really talk about. I think chapter 21 has a lot of interesting content because of that and how serious it is, right? Anyway, I was just going to finish talking about chapter 21, then we'll move on to chapter 22, because I know I talked a lot about this one guy, right? And there's other guys along the way to talk about. So next we have his son Amon. And Amon apparently is a bad king too, right? Because he kind of just kept doing the same thing his dad did. And apparently people got so fed up with him that they plotted an assassination plot, right? Because the funny thing is that, we read in the Kingdom of Israel. Now, in Israel's case, right? Since there was no, covenant line, there wasn't a real dynasty, right? Now, for those of you who may be confused when I use the word dynasty, think of how in ancient Chinese history, a dynasty refers to when a certain family ruled the throne, right? And so, that's why we have the Ming dynasty was when there was the Ming family that ruled the empire at that time for a couple hundred years. And then of course, there's other dynasties like the Song dynasty and the Qing dynasty and whatnot, right? And so when they talk about a dynasty in that sense, it's about a particular family that rules the throne. And the Bible has this too in the Kingdom of Judah, right? The Davidic line is basically a dynasty, right? And so while Judah had that as an insurance of how they selected kings, Israel wasn't like that. And that's why when we were reading some of the stories about Israel's kings, there was a lot of not controversy, but certain plots, right? I guess they would be controversy plots, and assassinating people and putting new people in power and whatever, right? Excuse me, a lot more backstabbing, figuratively and literally in Israel. And in Judah, they didn't really have that, right? Until we got to Amon, because that's how bad he was, right? That people were so ready to oh, let's just get rid of, the Davidic line. They were so ready to do it. And they just, assassinated Amon. But of course, once again, his son ends up taking the throne anyway. Now, let's see how this son of Amon does in chapter 22. Chapter 22. Now Josiah was 8 years old. Oh, hang on. Sorry. We got this thing going off. The water pipe. Okay, I think it's okay now. Alright, let's try that again. Chapter 22. Now Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adiah, and she was from Bozkath. That's an awesome name right there. From Bozkath. And Josiah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. Now in the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah sent the secretary, how the hell do you say that? Shaphan, son of Azaliah, the son of, here we go, Meshullam, to the temple of the Lord. And he said, "Go up to Hilkiah, the high priest, and have him get ready the money that has been brought into the temple of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have collected from the people. Have them entrusted to the men appointed to supervise the work of the temple, and have these men pay the workers who repair the temple of the Lord, carpenters, builders, and masons, and also have them purchase timber and dress stone to repair the temple. But they need not account for the money entrusted to them, because they are honest in their dealings." Now Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord." And he gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan the secretary went to the king and reported to him, "Your officials have paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord, and have entrusted it to the workers and supervisors of the temple." Then Shaphan the secretary informed the king, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." And Shaphan read it in the presence of the king. Now when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes, and he gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, and apparently Ahikam, son of Shaphan, and Akbor, the son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah, the king's attendant. "Go and inquire of the Lord for me, and for the people, and for all Judah, about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us." Now Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Akbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to speak to the prophet Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, the son of Tikvah, the son of Harvest, keeper of the wardrobe. Damn, that's a long title. Now she lived in Jerusalem, in the new quarter. And she said to them,
"This is what the Lord says. The Lord of Israel says, tell the man who sent you to me. This is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me, and burned incense to other gods, and aroused my anger, by all the idols their hands have been made. My anger will burn against this place, and will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Because your heart was responsive, and you humbled yourself before the Lord, when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become a curse and be laid waste, and because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring upon this place."
"Oh, now my dad's yelling about something, so I think he's done now." And so they took her answer back to the king. Alright, so chapter 22. Not a lot to talk about here because we'll talk more about it in chapter 23. And basically how Josiah attempts to restore, you know, Jerusalem and restore Jerusalem's relationship with God. But, you know, from this prophetess's words, basically the damage has been done, man. Like, you're on your own. Judah's basically on its own, but because Josiah was a decent enough king, you know, God will postpone it, right? He's not going to let Judah get obliterated yet. He's going to wait until after Josiah dies, right? But, you know, when he's what, king at 8 years old and only reigns for 31 years, he doesn't live for all that long, right? That's only like, he dies before the age of 40, like, ouch, right? But basically, you know, God postpones what's going to happen. But at the same time, God's kind of like, well, because of this continual sin that you have, what's going to happen is inevitable, right? You cannot escape this because, you know, you've kind of made your bed of nails and you better lie and you're going to lie in it, right? And so, sure, God kind of delays it and doesn't allow Josiah to see this happen. But at the same time, like, God's like, well, it doesn't matter what you do because, you know, the godlessness of this nation has already doomed you. Which is a scary thought, right? Because, you know, you think of, like, in the world today, and, you know, for a long time, just got to admit, right, that, like, whether you're in the States, Canada, lots of places in the world, is, you know, a lot of rejection of God. And when the bad things that, you know, everybody thinks is going to happen, you know, you can watch all those crazy, like, things online about people saying, like, oh, you know, everybody thinks the end times is relatively soon because of how far away people have gone from God, and now all this other funky stuff is happening. And I think a lot of naysayers, if you will, basically say, like, well, the end of the world is coming sooner than later because since there's all these things happening in the world that look pretty bad for humanity as a whole. Oh, I think that is a spam thing, so let's get rid of that. Just a spam thing in my comments there. I just saw it, so don't need any of that spam, you know, attempt to get people to, like, hey, you can get these, like, nice things, and then it's like actually them hacking your account and whatever, right? So you can get out of here. Don't go fishing like that, all right? You know, theft is a big sin, you know, so don't go around committing theft, all right? But anyway, back to, you know, what we just read here. And the scary reality of, like, okay, we've pushed out God for so long, and then all these things are happening in the world now, and a lot of naysayers, if you will, are saying, like, well, the end of the world will come sooner because people may think that, oh, these bad things are happening, we can just say, oh, God save us, right? But a lot of people have kind of just conceded that, like, nah, God isn't going to save us. We don't deserve to be saved at this point. Even with the blood of Christ over us, some people are that negative about it, right? They're like, well, even with the blood of Christ over us, no, like, God ain't going to save us, right? We've pushed God out for so long that no, right? Like, God isn't going to save us. And that's where all the naysayers come from, right? And so the point I'm getting at here, sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. The point I'm getting at is that, you know, it's a very, how serious it was that, like, you know, for a long time, and especially with, like, in the Book of Kings' case, you know, with Manasseh and Amon, and then in our modern case, you know, like, people our society's been doing this for years, for decades, and doing this a lot within the last few decades. This pushing God out and saying like, well, we don't want you here, God, and God's basically saying like, fine, I got better things to do anyway, right? And so, but at the same time, when people adopt that attitude of saying like, well, no, we don't want you around, God, don't expect that like, okay, God's gonna bail you out when the awful times come. And that's kind of the message that's put here before Josiah, right? It's like, well, sure, you're a decent guy, but God isn't really gonna bail you out, right? Well, maybe you personally, Josiah, because you're not gonna live long enough to see the fall of Jerusalem. So I guess you personally get bailed out. But Judah as a whole, like as a nation, God isn't going to bail them out. And so that's a pretty scary thing for this prophetess to be telling them, right? And it's one of those things where like, why a lot of people in the ancient world, like in ancient Jerusalem, early Jerusalem, I guess, didn't like the prophets in general. It's kind of that thing, right? And we see this in the world today as well. It's like, okay, people that's just kind of done whatever with their lives, and then they finally think like, oh, like, please tell us that God's going to do something good, even though like they themselves expect someone else to do it. And that's the other fundamental problem of our culture, right? Is that like, okay, people just want to live their lives, fine, that's the liberal society in a nutshell. You can live the life you want to. But when all the omens come, if you will, right? And then they go like, oh, Christian people, appease to God. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that, right? We can't do your work for you, right? That's not how it is, right? And in the same way here, that's kind of what the prophetess is saying. It's like, well, your work alone won't do it. God's already, he's already gone. He's not gonna bail out Judah. What's gonna happen is gonna happen. Judah just has to be okay with that. In the same way, like, America and Canada, pushed out God for so long. What's gonna happen is gonna happen. And you can't just expect an easy bailout, right? Which, I mean, when I put it that way, I know that makes it sound like super depressing, and probably a reason why a lot of people don't like to read the Book of Kings, especially in churches today, because that's a very tough message to take. That's a very tough thing to listen to, and it's just kind of how it is, right? If we as a society continually push out God, we can't expect Him to like come help us out later. And from the looks of things, things are getting pretty bad, right? Of course, I try to go against the argument that things are quote unquote worse today than they were years ago. That's not necessarily true, right? People have always done pretty awful things. The only difference is like certain awful things are celebrated in the world today, and that's why people think there's more evil, right? It was just not in the darkness anymore, but it has been brought out to light. But instead of being called out for being evil, it is instead celebrated. That's the difference of quote unquote the level of evil in the world today. That's kind of how I would frame that. I can maybe go into that a lot deeper in a future video, but for now, I'll just kind of leave it at like, because we've, because of our society's doing the evil that it does and celebrates it, right? Well, God has left us to the fate we deserve, right? And so, how's the old saying go, right? What goes around comes around, right? And so, because in a matter of speaking, in America and in Canada, we've done so many awful things. Well, when the awful things are going to come back for us, right? And you can't just be like automatic pray it away, right? It's not how it works. I mean, that's a very depressing thing to hear, but that's the reality of it. And that is what the Book of Kings is also getting at back then with Israel. So, you can read the Book of Kings and see like, yeah, that's how it is. And we can see that today's world isn't that different. But of course, you know, once again, the little flicker of hope is that, well, you personally, because of your belief in God, you know, God will spare you personally, right? And that's what the prophetess assures of to Josiah. Well, you personally won't have to face that because God has delivered you, because of your faith, right? Your faith, God has delivered you. In the same way today, you know, as we believe in Jesus, our faith in Jesus will deliver us, right? And so that is the hope of which, you know, Christians live, right? So even in dark times like now, the Christian can move forward in life because we know we are delivered by Christ himself. And that is a greater privilege, right? And that overcomes. And that's what the Bible talks about in the New Testament of the world. Christ overcame the world, right? And so you and I, you know, as, you know, to my fellow believers, as believers, you know, we don't have to be depressed about the coming gloom, right? We don't have to be overwhelmed by the coming gloom because with the Holy Spirit in us, we overcome the gloom, right? And that's, you know, that's a very reassuring thing, and for us to live our faith boldly, right? Okay, so I'm going to jump to chapter 23, and then we're going to talk more about Josiah himself, because I think we should read chapter 23, which also has the second half of Josiah's story. So let's just read that, and then we'll talk more about Josiah himself. All right, so chapter 23. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, and he went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord and keep his commands, statutes and decrees, with all his heart and all his soul, thus confirming the word of the covenant written in this book. Then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. The king ordered Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests next in rank and the doorkeepers to remove from the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and Asherah and all the starry host. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley, and took the ashes to Bethel. He did away with the idolatrous priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense on the high places of the towns of Judah and on those around Jerusalem, and those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and to the moon, and to the constellations and all the starry hosts. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He grounded it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. He also tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, the quarters where women did weaving for Asherah. Now Josiah brought all the priests from the towns of Judah and desecrated the high places, from Geba to Beersheba, where the priests had burned incense. He broke down the gateway at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the city governor, which was on the left of the city gate. Although the priests of the high places did not serve at the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, they ate unleavened bread with their fellow priests. Now he desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire of Moloch. He removed from the entrance to the temple of the Lord the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun, for they were in the court near the room of an official named Nathan Melech. Josiah then burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. He put down the altars that the kings of Judah had erected on the roof near the upper room of Ahaz, the altars Manasseh had built in the two courts of the temple of the Lord. He removed them from there, smashed them to pieces, and threw the rubble into the Kidron Valley. The king also desecrated the high places that were east of Jerusalem on the south of the hill of corruption. Well, with a name like that. The one Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the vile god of Moab, and Molech, the detestable god of the people of Ammon. Now Josiah smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the sites with human bones. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even the altar and the high places he demolished. He burned the high place and grounded it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole also. Then Josiah looked around, and when he saw the tombs that were there on the hillside, he had the bones removed from them and burned on the altar to defile it, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by the man of God who foretold these things. Now the king said, "What is that tombstone I see?" Or sorry, I didn't do a good voice for him. What is that tombstone I see? And the people of the city said, "It marks the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah, and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done to it." "Leave it alone," he said. "Don't let anyone disturb his bones." So they spared his bones and those of the prophet who had come from Samaria. Now just as he had done at Bethel, Josiah removed all the shrines at the high places that the kings of Israel had built in the towns of Samaria, and that had aroused the Lord's anger. Josiah slaughtered all the priests of those high places on the altars, and burned human bones on them. Then he went back to Jerusalem. Now the king gave this order to all the people: "Celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in the book of the covenant. Neither in the days of the judges who led Israel, nor of the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, had any such Passover been observed." Oh, whoops, I wasn't supposed to do his voice at that part, but whatever. "But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem." So basically it took him that long to get all this done. 18 years? Yeah, I guess it sounds about right. I mean, he had a lot of work cut out for him. Now furthermore, verse 24, Josiah got rid of the mediums and the spiritists, the household gods, the idols, and all other detestable things seen in Judah and Jerusalem. And he did this to fulfill the requirements of the law written in the book of Hilkiah, the priest, who had discovered... He did this to fulfill the requirements of the law written in the book that Hilkiah the priest had discovered in the temple of the Lord. Nevertheless, before nor after Josiah was there a king like him, who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and all his soul and all his strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses. Nevertheless, though, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger, which burned against Judah, because of all that Manasseh had done to arouse his anger. So the Lord said, "I will remove Judah also from my presence, as I have removed Israel. And I will reject Jerusalem, the city I chose, and this temple, about which I said, my name shall be there." So as for the other events of Josiah's reign and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Now while Josiah was king, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. King Josiah marched out to meet him in battle, but Necho faced him and killed him at Megiddo. Josiah's servants brought his body in a chariot from Megiddo to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land took Jehoaz, the son of, or Jehoaz, I guess, because we're in Judah, so we got to pronounce the J's now. Jehoaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in place of his father. Verse 31. Now Jehoaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 3 months. Yikes, that's it? His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah, and she was from Libnah. Now he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his predecessors had done. Pharaoh Necho put him in chains at Riblah in the land of Hamath, so that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he imposed on Judah a levy of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in his place of his father Josiah, and changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoaz and carried him off to Egypt, and there he died. Jehoiakim paid Pharaoh Necho the silver and gold he demanded. In order to do so, he taxed the land and exacted the silver and gold from the people of the land according to their assessments. Now Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 11 years. His mother's name was Zebedah, daughter of Pedaiah, and she was from Rumah. And Jehoiakim also did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his predecessors had done. Yikes. So yeah, chapter 23 and 22. So let's talk about 22 and 23, the first half of 23 anyway. We talk about, Josiah, right? Josiah he was pretty out there too, right? Just like his great-grandfather, Hezekiah. And, wanted to get rid of all the high places. But, Josiah went he was even more hardcore than Hezekiah, right? Because, the Bible doesn't record of Hezekiah killing, the cult prostitutes and killing the priests of the other gods and whatnot, right? Whereas Josiah goes out and just basically kills all of them, right? Because he's like, no, I'm not taking any chances, right? And so, I mean, from a tactical standpoint, to not take any chances of letting these other priests around, it would, at least Josiah hoped it would prevent more tainting in the land. But of course, as modern readers, it's easy to read Josiah as a bit of a tyrant. And I know a lot of people once again, as modern readers, I guess we're so used to a more liberal society where even as and this is where I get flack for this too, right? Where okay, I'm not going to go around, telling people what to do and telling people that no, you can't do anything of that's different from my belief system, right? Because that's how tyrants act, right? And of course, ironically, that's what a lot of the woke people do, right? And it's ironic, right? And in a way, people complain about this tyrannical behavior Josiah has, but then modern Christians nowadays don't behave like that, right? Because Christians have been facing flack for so long. I guess we've kind of conceded to okay, we're not gonna act that way, right? But then of course, when Christians don't act that way, now it's the people claiming to be on the right side of history who act in this tyrannical manner. Not that I'm condoning, Josiah's actions, because I'm not. It's easy to condemn them because he is acting a little bit tyrannical, even for the right reasons, right? And the old saying, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so, I don't want to say that Josiah, what he did was ultimately bad. He tried his best, but at the same time, the big danger is that tyrannical behavior. But of course, the irony I wanted to point out is that you don't see Christians act like this very often, right? And any Christian that acts in this way, other Christians are quick to denounce them. But then, of course, the people who do act this way, the tyrannical people, right? Well, partly because, like, for example, feminism needs this kind of tyrannical behavior. I know it sounds really bad for me to say it that way, but it's true, right? That's why, you know, you find a lot of them also accept Marxism, which Marxism itself is extremely tyrannical. The whole premise of Karl Marx's thinking is be a tyrant, rule the people with an iron fist, right? And so it's kind of ironic that way, right? And, you know, people don't think they're going to hit that because they think, like, well, if we just have, like, on a road to socialism, I think we know when to stop. But if history's taught anything, humans don't know whenever to stop anything, right? So, you know, I know all those socialists with good intentions, and similar to Josiah, right? You may have the good intentions, but the natural road to your quote-unquote good intentions will be the tyrannical behavior, right? And so I think reading Josiah, even though Josiah, once again, you know, the Bible tries to paint him as a good guy, but at the same time, I think there's a very interesting telltale, you know, thing to, you know, a moral lesson to pay attention to in Josiah's story. And it's easy for us as moderns to kind of pick up as, like, this is actually potentially very bad. And it's that, you know, don't be a tyrant. And I think this, you know, reading Josiah's story can be helpful to reflect on the book of Samuel when I hammered in the theme of that book, right? Only God can be king. Because even well-meaning guys like Josiah can become tyrannical. And so that's something we definitely have to watch out for. Now, the reason why I bring up, like, even with Josiah's good intentions, he was tyrannical. You can tell that people, I like to think that, you know, people back then probably viewed Josiah as tyrannical, even though the Bible tries to paint him in a more positive light, that he's trying to do all the right things. But his actions, you know, despite good intentions, were extremely tyrannical. Just like Edelgard in Fire of the Three Houses. How about that, right? So, I know I just had to bring that up, but it's the exact same thing, right? You know, shameless plug-in, but go watch my Fire Emblem Three Houses Let's Play, you know, on the channel. I have a playlist, a completed one too. I updated it finally. But anyway, so, you know, you look at the story of, like, Edelgard in Three Houses, right? Like, she had good intentions, right? But she was extremely tyrannical, and, you know, Josiah may appear that way, and I think he actually probably did on from a historical lens, because, you know, we jump to the end of chapter 23, right? And his two sons, right? Which, you know, then you run into things like, was Josiah really as great a guy because he had multiple wives, as you can see here? You're going to see pretty quickly. He had 2 wives. So was he really as good a guy as we think he is? Once again, Josiah is celebrated for his good intentions, but there are things he does that aren't as great. And even though the Bible says, like, well, he was better than, you know, a lot of the kings before him and any of them after him, one, and you have to, you know, take this with a grain of salt, right? Because the issue that the Bible also points at, and once again, you know, when I talk about the book of Samuel, the main theme of only God can be king, because all humans are easily susceptible to corruption. I mean, when you say Josiah is a better king than, you know, his predecessors and definitely some of his successors, well, one, as moderns, we like to think we're, you know, morally superior. One, because we have Jesus and the Christian legacy, even as we move away from, like, you know, Christendom, right? We still have the Christian legacy, and that's how people still develop morals, even if they don't want to attribute it to God himself. we would still attribute it to what is called the Christian legacy. So there's that. So because of the Christian legacy, you know, pronouncing out morals it should be easier as a modern person. In addition, you know, to the modern believer, you know, a modern Christian, you know, we have the power of Christ, which supersedes anyone, right? And once again, we have the real ultimate king as king in the person of Jesus Christ. So there's that, right? And the reason I have to bring that up is because, you know, when you look at any of these older guys in the Old Testament, and, you know, I'm willing to give them some slack because we as moderns have an advantage over them. But at the same time, when it says something like, "Oh, Josiah was much better than any of the previous kings and anyone after him," yes, that is a true statement the Bible's making. But you have to also remember that that's not a very high bar to beat, right? Like, let's be real. When we compare Josiah to like two kings before him, his dad and his grandfather, and his two sons that are kings after him, right? When you compare Josiah to them, like, yeah, not much of a benchmark. It doesn't take a lot to be better than them, right? And so you got to take it with a grain of salt because, once again, we also read some things in between the text that Josiah, due to our modern standards, would not be the best of people either. This is one of the things I mentioned where, like, we're, you know, going back to the book of Genesis, when Noah is evaluated as, like, he was righteous in his generation, which, you know, as moderns we would say, well, that's not a high bar to set because everybody was pretty awful. And then to be better than, like, the worst of the worst would not be a high benchmark. And so you have to take that little bit of grain of salt too when we read Josiah's story, because there are some things in between the line. And the reason why I cover this is because I don't want to, like, just say, oh yeah, he was better than, like, he was a great king. But then you can clearly see there are some problems here, right? One, he was pretty merciless, just like David kind of was once upon a time. And then, of course, you know, he has multiple wives, right? So polygamy is still a very big problem in royalty in general. Doesn't matter if you're a worshiper of God or not. If you're a king, you tend to be polygamous, right? Because once again, that's kind of, you know, when you have power, you can do that, right? People with power tend to do that, right? Having multiple sexual partners, which God generally is against, right? And so I point that out so that even though the Bible says, you know, he was better than anyone else, I don't want people to have this false sense of, like, well, I thought he was supposed to be like a perfect king. How come he's got these flaws in him? It's like, well, the Bible only says he's better than, like, his predecessors and successors. And I'm going to point out that that's not a high benchmark, right? Now he did some good things, right? But at the same time, once again, no human king is perfect. We just have to accept that. At the same time, you know, I don't want to just say that so that we can be mean to Josiah as well. Once again, as I mentioned with David, as I mentioned with Saul even, and other kings in the Bible, minus the really, really awful ones, right? But a lot of the guys that they had some good things about them, but then they also failed in a lot of things. We still have to give them a bit of grace because, one, you know, they don't have the power of Jesus to really, like, empower them the same way that we do as moderns, right? And that's why, you know, we make a big deal as Christians about, like, the power of the Holy Spirit living in us, right? Because that's what empowers us to keep living up to, you know, Jesus' commandments, right? It's the Holy Spirit that empowers us to do that. And since the Holy Spirit lives in us, something that is not often attributed in the Old Testament at all, right? You kind of have to give some leeway. You know, we as, like, modern day Christians have a huge advantage, right? So that's why I'm willing to give a bit of grace. And secondly, you know, as people who have the Holy Spirit, and even with that, we can still fumble and fail at times. Well, recognize each other's mortality and our humanity, right? That some people just fail, and Josiah is no different. And I think I just want to break down that misconception about Josiah at times. On the one hand, yeah, he's better than, like, other kings because a lot of them were pretty shit. But at the same time, you know, like, he's not this paragon of virtue either, and I think that needs to be paid attention to. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because I'm kind of covering my bases for the next little section too, of like, if Josiah did all these good things, right? You know, destroying a lot of the cults and idol worship in Jerusalem in his time. Well, we quickly read that that all came back. Like as soon as he was gone, and then his son, one of his sons reigns for like 3 months, which is like I think one of the shortest reigns. I think the only guy with a shorter reign than this was that one dude in Israel who only reigned for like 2 weeks. Like, damn, that's like low, right? To be king for like only 3 months is really low. Like the 2 weeks guy, like that's the record low. But to only be king for 3 months, and in that 3 month time, he brought all the bad stuff back, right? So this leads me to think, and you know, based on what we read, I don't just think of this as my opinion alone. But that's the danger of the tyrannical behavior, right? Even if you think you're doing the right things. Once again, I'll use the three houses analogy, right? Whether you're talking about Rhea in the Church of Saros or Edelgard in the Empire's Reform, you know, they may have good intentions. Both of them have good intentions. But they both also act like tyrants, and that's why nobody can trust either of them, right? That's why they're both bad people, right? Is because they're tyrants. And Josiah shows those same kind of, you know, inklings, right? He may have the good intentions, but he acted like a tyrant. And people clearly do not like the tyranny because as soon as he was gone, people went back to the way things were, right? Because I assume, and you know, the Bible's evidence here is clearly on my side in this opinion, but you know, they must not have liked his reform because it was too much. And once again, you know, when you want that much change, you have to be tyrannical, right? It's the same kind of telltale warning to, like, you know, a lot of activism today. And this is where, once again, I made that really controversial my hot take, if you will, of like why, like, for example, feminists need tyrants in order to really push their feminist agenda. Is because the kind of reform they want cannot happen naturally. It cannot happen naturally. That's just the way it is, right? So if the transformation that you want doesn't happen naturally, well then how are you going to get it? You have to force people to do it. The only way you can, but if you have to force people to do it, then you have to be tyrannical. That's kind of the nature of it, right? Because you can't just be like, oh, you know, it would just be, you should just stop thinking the old-fashioned way because you can't make people think what they think, right? So the only way to change how people think is to force people. But to do that, you have to be a tyrant. Or you need tyrannical power. And that was probably what happened with Josiah. He was using tyrannical power as one, the king of Judah. So there's that. And so he was using tyrannical power to achieve what he did, right? And then people quickly were like, no, we're not having this. And they went back to their sinful ways, right? Kind of like people today, huh? So once again, you know, I guess I keep emphasizing that too because once again, you know, the Bible, despite how old it is, it easily applies to us as moderns because people back then are not really different from people today, right? Human beings are a pretty stable thing throughout history, right? On the one hand, that's good because then that's why we can trust like history because we can be like, oh yeah, I can totally see that happening. On the other hand, all the bad stuff that happened in history, well, you can expect it to happen today because people don't change that much, right? Oh no, right? So it's that double-edged sword, right, about the human condition. But it's one of those things that we should be very mindful of, right? Anyway, let's get a move on here. We got 2 more chapters to cover, and then we're going to be done the Book of Kings. Well, I do have some closing notes, so we'll have to go over that too. But we're almost there, guys. We're almost there. I'm feeling a little bit tired, but we'll make it, guys. We'll make it. Alright, chapter 24. Now, during Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he turned against Nebuchadnezzar and rebelled. The Lord sent Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against him to destroy Judah, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by his servants and the prophets. Now surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence, because of the sins of Manasseh and all that he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. That's hardcore. As for the other events of Jehoiakim's reign and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoiakim rested with his ancestors, and oh my goodness, are you for real? Okay. Just a caveat as we go into verse 6. Jehoiakim with a K is the dad. Now technically, his son's name is pronounced the exact same way. It would also be Jehoiakim. But in English, we use a CH, and we're going to use the English CH sound to differentiate him. So we have Jehoiakim, and now we have Jehoiachin. Even though in actuality, they would both be pronounced the same way. Because the CH would also be like a K sound. It would be Jehoiakim or Jehoiakim as well. But for the sake of reading this, and I'm going to say this now before we get too much confusion, I will differentiate him by calling him and purposely mispronouncing it as Jehoiachin. Alright, let's move on. Verse 6. Jehoiakim rested with his ancestors, and Jehoiachin, his son, succeeded him as king. The king of Egypt did not march out from his own country again, because the king of Babylon had taken all his territory, from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River. Now Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 3 months. Yikes, another short reign. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan, and she was from Jerusalem. Jehoiachin did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. Now at that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, and his nobles, and his officials, all surrendered to him. Now in the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiachin prisoner, as the Lord declared. Nebuchadnezzar removed the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace, and cut up the gold articles that King Solomon of Israel had made for the temple. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, and all the officers and fighting men, and the skilled workers and artisans. A total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the prominent people of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting, strong, and fit for war men, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans. He made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. Now Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. Wait a minute. Was he like a young uncle or something? I guess he was. He's like an uncle that's like barely any... He's like an uncle that's younger than like... No, I guess, yeah. He's like an uncle that's like only 3 years older than his nephew. Weird, but I can roll with it. So Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 11 years. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah, and she was from Libnah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as Jehoiachin had done. Just as Jehoiakim had done. See, this Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin thing is really confusing. Verse 20. It was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end, he thrust them from his presence. I'm gonna need a bit of fruit here for that juice. So chapter 24. As we wrap up near the end of the book of Kings, I mean, we know what's going to happen, right? Israel and Judah will no longer be a thing, as Israel was already conquered by the Assyrians a number of years back, and now Judah's, been laid waste, right, by the Babylonians. Of course, the Babylonians, that would be a much more familiar name, all the Babylon references, right, and this great city. And in mythology, it's always referred to as like this great place, right? A place of power, anyway. And so, the place of power has shown up. And once again, it's like Judah, this tiny little kingdom, if you can even call it that. It's pretty tiny, right? Whereas like Babylon, modern day Iran, shows up, right? Once again, Iran is a big place, right? And so, this big empire shows up. And of course, there's other things too, where like Babylon would also have been like fighting with like Assyria and whatever, but they were just so powerful that it didn't matter. They could fight multiple wars on multiple fronts. I mean, to fight Judah would not have been like a big warring campaign, right? Not like when they had to fight the Assyrians, as we know in history. And so, Babylon shows up, and but the same thing with Israel we saw, right, where it's like you can't be playing these small games because eventually the big boys will show up, right? And that's what happened with Israel and Aram and their little skirmishes for the longest time, right? Well, they were just two little warring territories, and then the big boy comes and like Iraq shows up, right? And then now like Judah kind of had the same problem. They were stuck in a lot of civil turmoil because whether they should follow the Lord or not, and then they were ineffective because of the constant changing of politics in Judah. And then lo and behold, the superpower shows up. Babylon's here and they're ready to take over. And so, which is exactly what happened, right? And we had like another king, Jehoiachin. Like he barely lasts like 3 months as king, just gets conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. Because he probably did like, on the one hand it was probably like the tactical move where it's like, oh, we just surrender because we don't want to get wasted. And Nebuchadnezzar's like, nice, easy, right? You just intimidate them with numbers. And I mean, that's certainly one way to win battles, right? You just intimidate people with your huge numbers and the people just give up. And it makes sense to do that, right? Because, to fight the Babylonians would be to invite death, right? And so that ended up happening. And then, of course, we begin something called, the exile, the Babylonian exile, right? And if I were to keep reading Old Testament books, we could read like the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel takes place during it, the 70-year exile. And then you skip ahead to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. They take place after the exile, right? And so the exile is a pretty important part of Jewish history, and I mentioned this when we were talking about Hezekiah, where like the exile and the return from the exile after when the the Persians come into power. And then the Persians let the Israelites go back, and then there's like a rebuilding of the temple and everything. And along with that, there was a reformation of Judaism, right? And a lot more. First of all, Judaism became formalized, and then there was a reform within that, right? Because basically, the Israelites did not want that, a repeat of this, right? They didn't want a repeat of getting annihilated, first the Northern Kingdom, the Southern Kingdom by, two bigger nations, getting basically like annihilated and then like forced to live somewhere else and forced to conform to their culture. They didn't want that to happen again, right? Although inevitably it ended up kind of happening again with the Romans, right? But that's besides the point. The point is that, the exile really pushed a big change in how Judaism operated, right? Well, for starters, like Judaism actually became a thing, right? Like officially a religion in that sense, around that time, right? Because obviously, while Judah and Israel were worshiping God, at least some of the time anyway, the worship of God was a thing in Judah and Israel. Judaism, as we know it, was not actually formulated, right? That is a later product. And the Babylonian exile, which we've just read the beginning of it, is a big pusher of that. So, just a little bit of like where this is in history, right? And why this happens the way it does, right? And it changes how, and to this day, how is the land of Israel, modern Israel, kind of is, right? The much more formalized Judaism that we have today, that still lives on today, right? Is a big part of that is the Babylonian exile. And so here in Kings 24, or 2 Kings 24, we kind of just read the origin of that, right? The beginning of the Babylonian exile. Of course, there's this funny thing with like Zedekiah. He's only 21 years when he became king. That makes him only 3 years older than his nephew, which is kind of weird. But I mean, weird things can happen all the time in real life, right? Like in King of the Hill, the whole joke of like, Bobby Hill has an uncle that's like 12 years younger than he is, right? With Good Hank. Yes, I will reference that again, because, I mean, King of the Hill is such a good show. But anyway, so, if we can have Bobby Hill be 12 years older than his uncle, I guess it's not a far stretch for the Bible to have, like, a king only 3 years older than his nephew, right? And the funny thing is that his nephew, who he's 3 years older than, was the king before him. Just kind of weird to wrap your head around that, but hey, the world has shown weirder things. So, and it's one of those things where people think, well, the Bible is just so out there. How can like people think it's real when like some of the stories are so out there? It's like, dude, have you seen the real world? Have you actually been out there in real life? Real life is pretty damn weird, right? And it is. And I mean, to be fair though, that's part of the spice of life, right? If life didn't have that kind of weirdness in it, honestly, most people would not enjoy living very much, because if there was nothing weird in real life, like, life would suck, right? It would just be that, we would eternally be stuck in the routine. You just go to work, everything be like, well, I mean, that's the whole premise of Pleasantville. Have you ever seen that movie? The whole premise of Pleasantville is that, like, well, the world of Pleasantville is like, oh, everything just this nice, sitcom-y universe. But then nothing weird ever happens in it, right? Until, of course, the main characters show up and then they bring change, right? Because they're outside agents of the Pleasantville world. Damn, that's a weird one to say fast. The Pleasantville world. Of course, the main characters, played by Tobey Maguire and Reese Witherspoon. It's an old movie. It's definitely worth watching. But anyway, you know, before they introduce, you know, new concepts to this world, the world is so boring, right? Because nothing happens, right? And so since nothing interesting happens, no one really, like, life is kind of this static thing that, you know, it's pretty uneventful for the characters, and so for the people in Pleasantville. And in the same way, you know, like, my defense of, like, when people say, well, the Bible has weird stories, is like, well, real life is also pretty weird. I mean, okay, maybe the plagues of nothing is plagues of Egypt level, but like, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that's like, actually, it's actually pretty tame compared to, like, we've seen some really weird stuff in real life, right? Um, you know, the rapid evolution of technology is one of them, right? Like, that's weirder than some of the stuff in this Bible, in the Bible, right? You think of, like, family relations of, like, you know, nephews being older than their uncles, right? And that's a real thing in, like, some parts of the southern states. King of the Hill is just a parody of that, right? And I mean, you know, we all throw those funny Sweet Home Alabama jokes of inbreeding, right? And there's a lot of weird stuff like that, and a lot of weird stuff in real life, right? The weirdness of the Bible doesn't compare in comparison, right? The Bible's pretty, like, normal, or, like, pretty uneventful in comparison to stuff in, like, real life. And of course, you know, not the most reliable source, but, like, you know, the whole premise of Jerry Springer when that was a thing, right? The whole premise of Jerry Springer is that, like, Jerry Springer brings onto the show the most bizarre of bizarre shit, right? And that's what his TV show basically rides on. It's just, like, the most bizarre of bizarre things, right? And then put a spotlight on it, right? But of course, you know, once again, the whole premise of it is he takes the most ridiculous things and puts them on stage, right? And puts them on his talk show, right? Talk show, right? And so, you know, stuff like, oh, a guy who's, like, king after his nephew, who he's only 3 years older than, is not remotely weird in comparison. Of course, now that I've referenced Jerry Springer, all credibility is thrown out the window, right? All my credibility just thrown out the window because I had to reference Jerry Springer. But the point I'm getting across is real life is flat out crazy, right? And so my objection to people's objection of the Bible is, like, no, real life is weirder than, like, most of the stuff in the Bible. Most stuff in the Bible is actually pretty tame. Anyway, that's not much else to say. Let's just finish up here because we're at the last chapter of 2nd Kings. We're here, guys. Chapter 25. Here we go. Chapter 25. Now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. That does not sound like a good plan, but here we go. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army, and he encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So basically, they fight for, like, a year and a half, for simple math. By the 9th day of the 14th of the 14th month. That's not possible. By the 9th day of the 4th month of the famine in the city, it had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah. But the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. There's a sense of irony here, but we'll talk about that later. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and then he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they gouged out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. How the hell do you say that? Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work on the vineyards and fields. The Babylonians broke up the bronze pillars and movable stands and the bronze sea that were at the temple of the Lord, and they carried the bronze to Babylon. They also took away the pots, shovels, wick trimmers, dishes, and all the bronze articles used in the temple service. The commander of the imperial guard took away the censers and sprinkling bowls, all that were made from pure gold and silver. The bronze from the 2 pillars, the sea, and the movable stands, which Solomon had made for the temple of the Lord, was more than could be weighed. Each pillar was 18 cubits high. The bronze capital on top of 1 pillar was 3 cubits, and was decorated with a network of pomegranates of bronze all around. The other pillar, with its network, was similar. The commander of the guard took as prisoners Sariah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. Of those still in the city, he took the officer in charge of the fighting men and 5 royal advisers. He also took the secretary, who was chief officer in charge of conscripting the people of the land, and 60 of the conscripts who were found in the city. Nebuzaradan, the commander, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. There at Riblah, in the land of Hamath, the king had them executed. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, appointed Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to be over the people, so he had left behind in Judah. When all the army officers and their men heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah as governor, they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, oh, these tough names, man. Johanan, son of Kareah, Sariah, son of Tanhumeth, the Netophathite, whatever. Jezaniah, the son of Makathite, and their men. Now Gedaliah took an oath to reassure them and their men. "Do not be afraid of the Babylonian officials," he said. "Settle down in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you." In the 7th month, however, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, who was of royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah, and also the men of Judah and the Babylonians who were with him at Mizpah. At this, all the people from the least to the greatest, together with the army officers, fled to Egypt for fear of the Babylonians. Verse 27. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the year Awel-Marduk became king of Babylon. He released Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes for the rest of his life and ate regularly at the king's table. And day by day, the king gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived. And that's the end of chapter 25 and by extension 2 Kings, and in a sense the end of the whole book of Kings. Boy, that was a doozy. There was a lot there. So just a quick summary of chapter 25. So, Zedekiah, unsurprisingly, is like, I don't want to be under someone else's reign. I'm going to rebel. It's like, you're the king of like a ruined kingdom against basically one of the main superpowers of the world. This cannot go well, right? This sounds like a terrible idea, which it ends up being, because he, along with a whole bunch of people, gets slaughtered, and then, before they actually, well, they don't actually kill Zedekiah right away. They just keep him prisoner. But I mean, he may as well be as good as dead, right? They butcher all his sons in front of him. They make him watch, basically, as they kill all his family. And then they gouge out his eyes, which is like the worst thing, right? Like, think of it like this. Like, the last thing he saw was his own sons getting killed. That was the last thing he saw. And then he had to keep living, right? As like, a blind dancing monkey. As they, take him in chains and take him back to Babylon, right? But I mean, Zedekiah kind of had it coming, right? That's kind of an idiot move to try and challenge the Babylonians like that. So with that, and then of course, chapter 25 shows how brutal the Babylonians get, right? Like they torch the temple, they strip any valuables. All the valuables are taken out. They burn the temple down. They burn the royal palace down. They burn it all down, right? The place is basically like a giant bonfire. Terrible, I know. But like, they turned Jerusalem to a giant bonfire, basically. And then like, the people that were left are like, they're instructed to kind of like, okay, now we have to work in this ruin. Like, that sounds great, right? Like, there's nothing like, oh yeah, now you're just like cattle, basically, just to do our work. And that's all like this once, great city is now just like, oh yeah, you're just turf land now. Make yourselves useful. Grow us some grapes for more wine, right? Make yourself useful is basically what Jerusalem had been reduced to. And so, and then of course, when Nebuchadnezzar tries to be like, okay, we're going to leave a governor, someone in charge, someone to be my representative. The Israelites end up just assassinating him because they're like, no, we don't like Babylon. But then at the same time, it's like, oh, we're scared of Babylon, so they retreat to Egypt. And then after all the people run away, it's like, oh, now Jerusalem literally is like a ghost town, right? And it's the interesting thing when you read through like the Book of Kings, right? When we started back in First Kings, right? And it began with like Solomon turning into like, this golden capital, right? And it's one of those interesting things where like, when it comes to like eras, we kind of have like this understanding of like the golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, right? The land of Judah, well, the land of Israel as a whole, but definitely Judah here, we saw that process. Solomon at the beginning of Kings, it was the golden age, right? And then there were times that were kind of rough, but the people were still making Jerusalem work pretty well, and that was our silver age, right? And then, of course, you know, we have the Bronze Age, which was this, like, the common people just did whatever, right? That's why everything's represented with bronze, right? And that's why, you know, that's where we get the idea of, like, Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, right? And, you know, we had all the bronze idols and stuff like that. The Bronze Age, and then finally, after the Bronze Age, there's nothing, right? The Bronze Age is, after the Age of Bronze, is just the Age of Bones, right? Where everything just dies, right? And that, you know, we treat like modern franchises like this, right? There was a golden age of a franchise, and then, like, after the golden age, it all goes quote unquote downhill until eventually a franchise dies. This is where this, like, that kind of concept is clearly evident here. And, you know, you see that decline, that descent for Israel, right? You know, they started so mighty with Solomon. We're reading through the Book of Kings, anyways. So they started so mighty with Solomon, and then, like, all downhill from there, right? And then it gets so bad to the point that it's like Jerusalem is left as a ghost town. Like, that's pretty extreme, right? It goes from, like, you know, that's essentially the center of the world, because people were, like, giving, you know, they were giving Solomon, and by extension Jerusalem, like, what, ridiculous amounts of gold. Like, I if you watch back to that stream, it was, like, quite a while ago. It was one of the earlier ones, right? Because we were talking about Solomon. You know, like, people were giving him, like, billions of US dollars equivalent of gold every year, right? Like, that was the golden age, and that was, like, you know, that's as good as it gets, right? People just forking you billions of dollars worth of gold. And then now it's like that same place, that same Jerusalem, we read here at the end of the Book of Kings, is like a ghost town. There's no one there, right? Except for the bones of the dead, obviously. But, like, yeah, Jerusalem basically, like, got reduced to nothing, right? And what the Bible gets at is that this is what happens when we, you know, when we walk away from God, right? Because, you know, when the temple was first dedicated, you know, to God, right? Solomon built the temple as, like, this big dedication to God, and, you know, Solomon wanted to be like, okay, I want to represent you, God, right? I want the wisdom to represent you, and God respected that request, and so Solomon was given that kind of power, and so it was kind of a representation of, like, when God is super close to the people, right? Life, prosperity, power, and whatnot, right? But the ghost town at the end of the Book of Kings shows that, like, this is what happens when God is no longer around, right? Because God had abandoned his people, essentially, right? Because, well, more like, I guess a better way of reading it is that he was kind of pushed out, and then God left, right? And so what happens when God leaves, right? So the contrast is when God was at the center of the people's attention, well, then there was prosperity, there was power, right? God leaves, and you have death, right? And, you know, unproductivity. You have, you know, everything just comes to a cold stop, and that's an eerie image, right? Of, like, the town, you know, Jerusalem. And it's weird to think that these two places are the same place, right? The ghost town of Jerusalem and the kingdom of Jerusalem. They were once the same place, right? But there's a clear contrast of what happens when God leaves the picture, if you will. And that's what the Book of Kings was painting, right? That was the picture they were painting for the reader, right? To really see that. And so, you know, the Book of Kings ends on such a bad note because it's telling that tale of, like, this is what happens. This is what happens when we abandon God. This is how bad it gets, right? We are completely undone. And that's exactly what happens. An interesting irony of the story as well, I wanted to point it out in chapter 25. The rest of chapter 25 is just kind of like whatever, it's just a historical event, you know, Jerusalem gets burned to the ground and whatnot. But there's an interesting irony here where, like, you know, Zedekiah, he he runs to the fields of Jericho. And I think the Bible mentions Jericho because it wanted the reader to remember how the tables have turned, if you will, right? Because, you know, as we read through the book of Kings, there was this continual theme of like, you know, the Israelites were doing the same things that the people that God drove out were doing, right? And the wording used was that, you know, Israel had become like the nations God drove out before them, right? Of course, that word, you know, that phrasing before them has two meanings, right? There's the chronological sense of like, you know, before that they were driven out, just like how we read here in the book of Kings, you know, Israel has been driven out of the land of Canaan, right? They were also driven out. And then, of course, before them is kind of like a royal kind of imagery, right? Like, you know, when you lay out the red carpet before the queen, right? Or the red carpet before celebrities, right? You lay it before them. And so it's like a in their presence and in their sight, right? And it shows that sense of grandeur, right? But of course, the irony here is that, you know, Israel was driven out just like those who had forsaken God before them, right? And that double entendre is very powerful and is a powerful image that the Bible uses, right? And so this is where, once again, that, you know, Judaism's traditions come up then later on. And once again, I mentioned this when I talk about the book of Genesis. The hot take of Genesis was that, well, of course the book of Genesis was edited, and the book of Ezra implies this because when the priests saw and understood the prophecies in Genesis about themselves, right? About this, they understood this in relation to the prophecies in Genesis. And so this image must have been very, very powerful in their minds, right? That like, because, you know, there's the Garden of Eden parallel, right? That Israel was cast out from the good life, the paradise, if you will, right? You know, Adam and Eve had the Garden of Eden. Israel once had the golden age of Jerusalem, right? But they were driven out. Adam and Eve were driven out because of disobeying God. The people of Judah were driven out because disobedience to God. Then, of course, there's the more immediate irony, right? When Zedekiah is brought to Jericho, well, Jericho is an important name, right? Because Jericho was the first place Israel conquered when they moved into Canaan, right? And that's where the double entendre of, you know, the Lord drove out those before them comes in, right? Because once again, it was part of Jewish memory, you know, their memorable history, that they knew that the people of Jericho were driven out before them, kind of like the red carpet illustration I use, right? They were driven out before them. And Jericho was the first of the people that they drove out. And so here now we have Israel being driven out, and they're at the place where they first drove out, you know, the people living in Canaan, right? And now the tables have turned, right? Now the Babylonians are driving them out, and they are now at the same place where they were driven, you know, where they first drove out, you know, the Canaanites, right? And so there's that. I'm sure there's that sense of irony that probably dawned on the Jews at that time, right? And so it's interesting there, right? And then of course, you know, the irony is then later played out more, where like how merciless the Babylonians were. That is parallel to how merciless, you could say, God was towards Jericho when he gave Israel absolute victory, right? Over the people of Jericho, right? You know, the walls broke down. That's a clear parallel, right? The walls of Jerusalem broken down completely, just like the walls of Jericho. Even though, yes, in the book of Kings, it's more natural means. It's not like God doing a magic earthquake or anything, but that's besides the point. The point is that, you know, the parallels there, right? The walls are broken in Jerusalem, just like how they were in Jericho. And then everything was burned down, just like in Jericho, right? Nebuchadnezzar looted the place entirely. He looted Jerusalem entirely. Well, technically through his servant Zaradan, but you get the point, right? Nebuzaradan completely looted Jerusalem, just like the Israelites completely looted Jericho. So that, like, definitely a lot of this, like, parallels to kind of show the irony is meant to emphasize, you know, how serious God was, and like this is how important it is to keep his commandments, because, you know, God drove out the Israelites just like how he drove out, you know, the people before them, right? Basically almost the exact same way, right? And so that the parallel of images is very powerful here in chapter 25 to kind of emphasize that, right? To show that, like, you know, this is the will of God, right? That evildoers are driven out, right? Of what should have been paradise, right? And of course, you know, the even though Canaan isn't like a paradise per se, you know, the Jews were given the land as like it was called the promised land for them, because it was a land that, you know, God was going to make them secure in. He was going to give it to them and make them secure there, right? And that was, you know, the reason why it's also the promised land. It's because of the covenant, right? That, like, oh, well, this was where Abraham encountered God, and that's how we know God, right? And so there's that the paradise lost kind of imagery is very powerful as well there. And, you know, the irony is meant to really emphasize that, right? And the Jews should have understood that very, very well. In the same way, you know, like, it's so easy for us to get caught up in how good life we have, you know, how good of a life we have, but, you know, disobedience to God can quickly change that, right? We can be easily driven out just the way we came in, right? And, you know, that's a very real possibility, you know, even in the 21st century. It's a very real possibility, and that's all the more reason, you know, we should not turn our backs on God, right? That, you know, we should follow his ordinances and his statutes, right? But of course, to the modern Christian, and, you know, our here's my little sermon spin, if you will. So, you know, that's we have Jesus to give us the power to do that, right? It is faith in Jesus that will ultimately allow us to do that, to live up to God's standards and be protected from, you know, impending doom that many people are so, you know, all the naysayers are like, oh, it's the end is coming. It's like, well, true or not, whether it's sooner or later, it doesn't matter. What matters is, do you have Jesus in your life, right? Because if you don't, well, then, you know, when this kind of thing will happen to you, right? Like in the Book of Kings. And that's why the Book of Kings is as important to read as it is, right? Because it's a very interesting metaphor of, you know, how badly one can fall, right? From the golden age to the ghost town, right? It can happen to anyone. But, you know, if we put our faith in Jesus, you know, he will provide for us, he will care for us, and he will lift us out of that, right? We will continually be in his golden age, right? Kind of thing. Although, once again, you know, God can't really have a golden age, because he can't have a descent from that. So there's no real golden age. Every age is like the golden age. So it can't really be the golden age. It's kind of weird, right? That's a weird transient of logic I'm working with there, but you know what I mean, right? But, you know, the Book of Kings is a telltale moral story of, like, this, you know, it's a very serious thing of not trusting God and even turning our backs on him, and how serious that is, right? It could very well be the end of the world in that sense, right? If we don't trust in God. And, you know, that's clearly what happened with Jerusalem in the story. And so, you know, I know it's like, it's one of those things where, like, we move into the Christmas season soon. But, you know, as we read through the Book of Kings ends on a really terrible note, right? The end of the world had come, based for all intents and purposes, right? The end of the world had come. And so, what do we do with that, right? What do we do with that? What do we do with the fact that that's something that could very well happen today, right? Just like how it was with, Jerusalem, right? That could very well happen today to any of us, and no matter where you live, right? That could happen. And so, what do we do, right? That's the $64,000 question. And so that's something I want you guys to meditate on, and always come back to, keep reading, your Bibles, and really ponder that question, because I think that's what makes the Book of Kings so important to read, is because it really plays out that end of the world scenario, right? And well, what are the people supposed to do, right? And how does and more importantly, as it relates to your life today, sure, this is an old story from way back, but how does this matter in our lives today, and what do we do with this knowledge and this practical wisdom as well that the Book of Kings paints out, right? Of how important it is to, believe in God, right? And to obey Him and to follow Him and to trust Him, right? How important that is, and how serious the consequences are if we disobey them and turn our backs on God. So, the Book of Kings, so it has that, that moral story. I think is important to really reflect on. But I want to end it there on that note, because, in a sense, we are actually continuing, not exactly in a chronological order, but we are continuing, this theme that we end off here on the Book of Kings. The end of the world has happened. Well, where do we go from there, right? Where does Israel go from there, and by extension, where do we go from there, right? And so I hope you guys will join me next week as we begin our Advent readings, as we are approaching the Christmas season. And I'm glad that I actually finished the Book of Kings just as we entered the Christmas season, because I think now, this is a time where, it's a good time to reflect on how good, God has been to us, as we read through, various Christmas passages and whatnot. And so I hope you guys will be interested in hanging out for those weeks. So the next 3 weeks of Bible reading will be Advent week, and that's how we're going to actually end the year, because I'm not going to read on New Year's Eve. I'm just going to tell you that now. I'm not reading on New Year's Eve. So basically we have 3 more Bible reading streams for 2021. Can you already, that's weird, right? 2021 is already at an end, 3 more Bible reads and that's it, right? 2021's over. But I hope you join me for those 3 Bible reading streams in December. They'll all be shorter than the one we just did, because once again I had to cover 5 chapters for starters. And 2, we're just doing a more Christmassy themed kind of Bible read. So they'll be much more they're less Bible studies, but more like just reading for Christmas. And so that's going to be the next 3 weeks. They're going to be shorter, but they'll still be at 3 o'clock. So only read to 3 to 4 kind of thing on those weeks. It'll be from 3 o'clock Pacific time to 4 o'clock. And just do hour-long Bible reads. That's it. That's going to be how we move into the Christmas season. And so I hope you guys will definitely come hang out for those Bible reading sessions. Anyway, that's basically it. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we end the stream today. So Monday we have a podcast, just Christmas stories, and a little bit of Christmas philosophy. I know, really weird, right? Christmas philosophy, what's that? Well, you want to find out, come to the Streaming Parson podcast at 4 o'clock on Monday. And then Wednesday we are playing a game. I'm not going to tell you which one it is yet. I mean, I'm just going to be really horsing around more than anything. And it's just going to be just a time to hang out, laugh, enjoy this Christmas season, right? And of course, it's also for me to get more into the gaming routine again. So that'll be Wednesday at 3 o'clock Pacific time. Next Thursday, we have Throwback Thursday as usual. Heroes of My Magic 2, Price of Loyalty. I'm moving through the campaign at a pretty steady pace. And then, of course, next Friday, as I mentioned already, first Advent Christmas reading stream. So that's how the next week is going to be looking. I hope you guys will come hang out in our December streams as we get into the Christmas season. Anyway, with that said, I hope you guys have a great Friday night and a great weekend. And I will see you guys on Monday for the Streaming Parson podcast. God bless you.